Our podcast is brought to you by We Pushback. In the last few years, a certain genre on social media has been plagued with informants who misrepresent the truth to benefit themselves. They've gone unchecked for far too long. This smoke and mirrors routine is what has plagued the criminal justice system, resulting in many wrongful convictions. We Push Back is about bringing attention to these informants who have little regard for the truth and offering a voice to all those impacted by their lies. This website will work as a united hub, bringing all related information to one portal. We Push Back.
Welcome back to A View from Mulberry Street. I'm Matthew Mary, your host, and as you know, our first 10 episodes were pretty serious monologues by me. And what we've been trying to do lately is to lighten it up a little bit and to get some guests on the show and to get some different points of view. You know, not every point of view comes from Mulberry Street or Matthew J. Mary. And today's guest is a very special friend of mine because he is not only a child prodigy in the radio business, but at the young age of, I don't know how old he is, probably about 42, he is a legend in the radio business and broadcasting. He was on, before he was on 770 AM, where he has his own show from 12 to 5 a.m. And then I think does the news on top of that. He produces other shows on 770 AM, John Catsimatidis, for example. And in the past, when he worked on 970 AM, he was the producer and sidekick for Joe Piscopo, for John Rambling with Gambling, for Curtis Sliwa, and many, many others. He's also a politician. He's not happy just to be a Republican or a Democrat. He started the Reform Party in our state. Not really started it, but adapted it. He's what you call a clean politician, if there ever was one. He's a big shot on Staten Island and every other place he goes to. Frank Morano, welcome to A View from Mulberry Street.
Oh, well, Matty, it's great to be here. I'm a big fan of yours and a big fan of this podcast. I'm a regular subscriber. I've seen all the episodes that have been posted so far, but listening to that introduction, I kept turning around waiting for somebody else to be in the room. I may have to hire you to write my eulogy, Matt. You're very kind.
At the end of the show, we want to talk about any special projects that you have. You know, Frank, you know everything. And I'm not patronizing you when I say you know everything about politics. You know everything about current events. On your show every night from 12 midnight to 5 on WABC 770 AM, you cover the world, you cover the nation, you cover human interest stories, but you seem through the years to have a special interest in all of these mob trials. I know that you, as busy as you are day and night, I know that in the past that you've taken time out to go in person to a lot of these trials over in the Eastern and Southern District. And I know from being a personal friend of yours that you really care about what's happening in our court system. So I guess my first question is, are there any of these so-called mob cases that stand out to you as being unfair? You know, if you've looked at all my podcasts, I guess you get the drift about what I'm trying to say about the federal criminal justice system.
Well, first of all, there are many. You know, I think anybody that I've covered a lot of trials, not just mob trials, but any case that ends up going to trial these days, you as a criminal defense attorney, Matty, know how rare it is to see a case even go to trial. So I think all the cases that end up going to trial end up being pretty rare and pretty special, because if they weren't rare, if they weren't special in some way, they would end with a plea agreement or something like that. But let me answer the second question first, and then I'm going to kind of work backwards. One of the things that I've seen in mob cases is, with respect to unfairness, is that they're all unfair. I've never seen any variety of criminal defendant, not bank robbers, not rank and file hoodlums, not Arab terrorists, treated the way that members of La Cosa Nostra are treated. And I remember I think it was a bail hearing for a multi-candidate defense, a multi-candidate arraignment, and you were representing someone, I'm not going to say who it was, and you made the case when the government was advocating staunchly and vociferously that this person, your client, should not be given bail. You basically said that the government had no problem offering this guy a deal 2 weeks ago and were very content to not only let him go home and go out on the street, but potentially continue to commit crimes. And now this same government is here wanting you to believe that this person is a danger to society and a menace that has to be locked up right away without even bail, even though there's no history of convictions. And I think that in a nutshell tells you everything you need to know about how the government and how the public, to some extent, views mob cases differently than every other variety of cases. And one other quick anecdote on that end. One of the first mob trials that I had covered was 17 years ago, was the John Gotti Jr. trial, the first trial of John Gotti Jr. And the government was doing something that was really rotten. They had secretly recorded a whole series of conversations that John Gotti Jr. had in prison with his attorney at the time, or an attorney representing him, Richie Raybach. Secret recording of an attorney and his client in prison. And it turned out in these conversations, John Gotti Jr. wasn't saying all sorts of gangster stuff and all sorts of criminality. Instead, he was caught saying things that were exculpatory, that bolstered the claim of the defense. And the government had the audacity. They had taped this guy without his knowledge, and yet he was saying things that were helpful to his defense. The government had the audacity to ask the judge not to allow these recordings that they had made because it challenged their narrative of events. And I never forget what his attorney in that case said to me as we were walking out the door to lunch. He said, "Did you see what just happened?" He said, "They're just as dishonest as we are." And I don't know if Jeff meant it that way, but he was exactly right. I've seen that when it comes to getting wins, and I think that win at all costs mentality, while it's more identified with street thugs these days, it's very prevalent in the U.S. Attorney's Office and in the FBI.
And Frank, everything you say is true. Going back to that bail case, that was just one of many. That was a spectacular bail hearing, because we're in front of Judge Lewis Kaplan, who's one of the toughest judges in the Southern District. Believe me, if you have a so-called mob case in front of Judge Kaplan, you better have your football helmet and your shoulder pads on, because he is a tough man. But what made Judge Kaplan jump out of his skin that day is that they had intercepted my client, who happened to be orthopedically in terrible shape. He was coming out of his session with physical therapy, barely walking. They throw him into a car. They tell him, "Here's the indictment against you. We're charging you with 2 murders from 22 years ago." Not that he committed the murders, that he had some role, they said. You know what conspiracy is, Frank. It isn't too hard to prove a conspiracy. You don't have to do anything. You just have to say something. Anyhow, they grab this guy and they tell him, "Listen, you're facing life without parole and many other charges against you. If you decide to cooperate with us, you don't even have to be arrested. We're going to drive you. We'll drive you home. You don't have to call Uber. You don't have to call a cab. Just give us a commitment that you'll wear a wire for us." And, so this fellow, my client, he says, "Take me to court, just take me to court." And that's it. So next thing you know, we're in front of Judge Lewis Kaplan, very tough judge. And the prosecutor has the audacity to tell the judge, "This man, he's so dangerous, he can't be allowed to be on the streets for another day." First of all, they're talking about crimes they say were committed 20 years before. He's been on the street for 20 years. Nobody did anything to lock him up. They were going to release him 2 days before if he would cooperate. And now they're saying he's too dangerous. Here's a man who at that time could barely walk. He's literally a cripple. Okay. And I tell the judge the story, and the judge tells the prosecutor, is this true? And the prosecutor says, oh, no, that's not true. And I say, well, let's call the FBI agent who did everything that I just said. He's sitting on the back row. He's sitting there. And the judge said, well, let's recess. We'll be back at 2:15, and we're going to have that agent on the stand. And he better be telling the truth. And the judge was hot. He was steaming. The steam was coming out of his ears. We come back after lunch, and the prosecutor backs down. He said, no, I'm not going to put that FBI agent on the stand because we need him as a witness later on. We can't use him right now. Of course, he didn't feel like committing perjury that day. And, of course, the judge set bail on my client. But, Frank, that's not just one case. That has happened to me so many times. I mean, dozens of times. And no one cares. And no one takes notice.
Oh, no, I'm sure. And I don't want to give people the wrong impression that I'm occasionally criticized by listeners and others as being an apologist for organized crime or as somebody that takes these issues lightly. I don't think the mafia or criminality in general is something that should be glorified or celebrated at all. I think especially these days, most of the people that choose to go into that kind of life are not only incredibly short-sighted, but pretty dumb, because you see how it ends up, and you see the kind of caliber of people that end up in that life now. However, that also means that I think people should be prosecuted and punished for their crimes. And you've seen over the last 30 years, probably more, but certainly much more pronounced over the last 30 years, the government essentially being willing to give a get out of jail free card to anybody that joins their team. Obviously, the most egregious example is Sammy Gravano, who did almost no prison time for 19 murders. But you don't even have to go that far. All you have to do is look at anybody that's willing to either overtly cooperate with the government or covertly cooperate with it. Sometimes they'll actually help you commit crimes, as was very credibly alleged with Lindley DeVecchio, the FBI handler for Greg Scarpa. So I don't have a high tolerance for crime, but I also have even less of a tolerance for letting criminals literally get away with murder just because they're willing to rat on their criminal cohorts and in many instances make up stories that enhance their role in certain events so that prosecutors can get the kind of convictions that they're looking for.
And Frank, that's what I call the rat system. And it's kind of a tool that the government uses, but without that tool, I don't think they'd have very many cases. The whole system of federal prosecutions in organized crime cases is based upon flipping people, and they don't care who they flip. They don't care if they flip Sammy Gravano, who they've been after for years and years. They don't care if they flip Joe Massino. They don't care if they flip Anthony Gaspipe Casso. I mean, these are people that they spent millions and millions of taxpayer dollars, following them day and night for years, for decades. And then all of a sudden, when they agree to take the get out of jail card, it's all over. They're absolved of everything. And then they go on the witness stand and the government vouches for their credibility. And Frank, here's what I want to ask you. The media very rarely questions what the government does. That's one of the reasons I have you on the program, aside from the fact that you're such a great friend of mine. You've done so much for me, which we'll get to later. But I mean, you're one of the few people of stature in the media who will give a fair shake to a defense lawyer at trial.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, Matt. I think part of that, I think you're right. I completely agree with you. I think there's definitely this rush to convict as soon as someone's arrested. I know whenever they have one of these big mafia takedown cases, and it seems like every 4 or 5 years we get one where the attorney general or the U.S. attorney or someone will come out and say, "Oh, this is the biggest mafia roundup in history." And all I'm thinking of, we see this press release so often, and all I think when, as these guys are all congratulating one another like they just won the Super Bowl, all I'm thinking of is, did they sit there and say, okay, I have 187 defendants wrapped up as part of this now. Previously, the previous record was 189. Let me find 3 other people that I can wrap up in this investigation so that I can say this is the biggest one in history. But all these people have been is accused of a crime, and yet they're out there celebrating as if the whole process is over, when in actuality, we're taught, if you believe in the Constitution and you believe in civil liberties, which I happen to, that this is only the beginning of the process. But the other thing that bothers me, Matt, is one of the things that I've noticed in watching a lot of, but just to go back to your question about the media, I think part of the problem is law enforcement has no problem leaking to the press like a sieve. Anything that comes out or anything that they have knowledge of, even if it's not presented in court, that is damaging to a defendant or a potential defendant, they have no problem giving to the press. Even if it's material that shouldn't be out there because it could prejudice a jury pool, they have no problem giving that. The mafia, at least historically, abiding by that code of omerta, I have noticed that in most cases, defendants and their attorneys are much less likely to want to give damaging material to the press, meaning damaging material to the prosecution. So I think part of it is these reporters rewarding their frequent sources and the people that give them their material frequently. I think also a part of it is reporters that cover cases. And this is why I'm a big proponent of beat reporting, but reporters who cover cases not really understanding what's important and what's not. If you're a reporter for a tabloid, the Daily News, the New York Post, for instance, and you're sent to cover a trial for one day, and you really don't have an understanding of the facts of the case or these broad criminal indictments or who's who, you end up reporting on kind of the silly aspects of it, the dopey nicknames or a funny story that a witness might tell. And I would read stories about cases that I was covering. Sometimes it would be on the front page. And I would say, wow, that was the least significant thing that happened yesterday. And yet, if you read the papers today, you think that's the only thing that happened in court yesterday. But the other thing that really bothers me, Matt, is this sort of chumminess that emerges between the prosecutors and these horrible thugs, criminals, murderers, and yet they act like they're the best of friends. I'll never forget, I went to the sentencing, and of course, shockingly, this person got no jail time, but I went to the sentencing of one person who was a long-time, cooperating witness for the government after leading a lengthy criminal career. And I see at the sentencing a former U.S. attorney, assistant U.S. attorney, who's now in private practice. And I overhear him talking to the case agent on this Rats case and some of the other AUSAs that were still in the U.S. attorney's office. And I hear him saying, as if to explain his presence, yeah, I promised so-and-so, meaning the rat, I promised so-and-so that I'd be here for him. And I'm thinking, this guy has no professional or legal obligation to be here, but he just became such chums with this criminal and with this murderer solely because they both had an interest in convicting the same people, that he's here instead of working somewhere or reading a book or taking a nap. He's here just because he's friends with the kind of person that he's worked a good portion of his professional life to put in prison.
And Frank, sometimes through my career, 46 years now, I've noticed that some of these United States attorneys and young FBI agents who come into the system, after I have, and I noticed that they're kind of naive at the beginning. Many of them turn into monsters. I mean, you talk about being a gangster. Some of these people, some of them, just become gangsters turned inside out. and they got a badge on them. They're supposed to be neutral. They're supposed to be fair. They're supposed to make sure that there are no mistakes in terms of what evidence goes into the case, and yet they'll let anything go in to win.
Yeah, especially if that means prejudicing the jury pool. You know, one case that I spent a lot of time covering because it was a lengthy trial. I think it was close to 8 weeks. And I spent a lot of time covering before and after because there was a lot of other legal issues related to it, was the trial of Tommy Schatz Gioeli, who the purported acting boss at one time of the Colombo crime family, a charge that he still denies. And what they put this guy through, not a wealthy guy. He had a court-appointed attorney, nothing against court-appointed attorneys, but he had a court-appointed attorney, not as some high-priced, legal shark. What they put this guy through before the trial even began was astounding. They had no problem leaking to the press and getting articles published about crimes that he was never even charged with. There was this big article in multiple New York City tabloids that he had killed a nun. Now, I don't know of something that's more prejudicial than getting your name out there with the murder of a nun, yet there was no real evidence of it. No evidence of it. He wasn't even charged with that crime. And Tommy Gioeli, and this is why I give him so much credit. One, I gave him credit because he didn't take a plea. He chose to go and take his shot at trial and put a case on, which is increasingly rare. But two, he actually set up a blog. And the only thing he did on this blog was give his side of the story, of the trial, what he saw, the case, the people involved in the case, the folks that were testifying against him, the prosecutor. It was just a competing narrative. And I thought it was great. This was the first time that I saw a defendant really go out there on a regular basis, putting this out there. Now, of course, the press mocked him. They called him the blog father. But the U.S. Attorney's Office worked so hard to shut this blog down. And all I'm thinking of is, wait a minute. On the one hand, you have no problem leaking information surreptitiously to try and prejudice the jury pool and taint the jury pool, but you're not going to give the person whose life is on the line here, potentially facing life in prison, the opportunity to speak out and talk about his own case. So I thought that was very telling how the U.S. Attorney's Office handled the Gioeli prosecution. And that's the other thing. In that case, they had charged him with 20 different counts of all sorts of crimes, 20-something predicate RICO acts. And then ultimately, he was acquitted of just about everything, except they found him guilty of count 1 RICO conspiracy. After charging him with 20-something predicate RICO acts, the jury found him guilty of 3, and 2 of them were duplicative. They were essentially the same charge. And my impression was that the jury felt that they were there for 8 weeks, that they had some sort of a vague impression that Tommy Gioeli was involved in gangsterism or being involved in the mob. And they felt an obligation to convict him of something. And I felt that the jury said, all right, let's throw the prosecution a bone. He's probably guilty of something. Let's try and give him the most, slap on the wrist conviction we can. And the judge, lo and behold, does with him the same thing I've seen judges do in a lot of other cases. They sentence you for crimes that you're acquitted of. Even though the jury makes the decision that, okay, we found this person's not guilty of these crimes, the judge says, well, it's my determination that you are. Even though the jury acquitted you, I'm sentencing you based on acquitted conduct. I think that's, I know it's been upheld by the Supreme Court, but I think that's un-American.
It's un-American, but it's not illegal. And they do it all the time, every time in organized crime cases. And in the case of Thomas Gioeli, also known as Tommy Schatz, he beat the murder case hands down. Hands down. And he gets sentenced to 20 years for a minor crime. Now, it turns out that while he's in jail, listen how unfair, you know how unfair the government can be, and you probably know this story. He falls and injures himself near a ping pong table because, it was wet. There was a negligent condition. And he gets awarded $250,000. You think he could send that home to his family that he's going to be in jail for 20 years? Maybe they could help support themselves. But instead, the government eventually took them years. It took them years. But they sued and sued until they seized all of that money. And they said, oh, it's part of your fine. It's part of your restitution. We're taking your money. What a bunch of gangsters. And to finish off on Tommy Gioeli, I get a call from a member of his family about 3 weeks ago, just asking my opinion about what was going on. Tommy Gioeli thought he was supposed to be at least in the halfway house right now. And instead of sending him to the halfway house, he really thinks that he should be released and be home by now. But there's no doubt that he should at least be in the halfway house. And instead they find something wrong with him, some medical condition, maybe cancer, and they ship him off to Butner, North Carolina, to the prison hospital, where they will do nothing for him. Believe me, my clients have died there. Carmine Persico died there. They're going to do nothing for Tommy Gioeli or anyone else. But they hold him over there, and they hold him incognito, like he can't talk to his lawyer. He can't talk to his family members. He can't get any visits because of COVID. And he's saying, I belong in the halfway house. Why do you have me in some prison hospital? Believe me, Frank, it's still going on. And who's going to come to this guy's defense?
The problem is, though, Matty, is whether you're talking Tommy Gioeli or, John Gotti Jr. or anybody, these are not isolated cases. You can look at every mafia case and you see a tremendous example of, at the very least, unfairness and what's pretty common, I view, criminality and suborning perjury. Look at the case of John Burke. John Burke was in a state murder case, was acquitted. Now, 30 years later, the federal government decides, well, we know you're acquitted 25 years ago, but we're going to charge you with murder in aid of racketeering. Well, wait a minute. I thought there was a prohibition against double jeopardy. Oh, no, sorry, there's not. And they convict him in a federal murder case for a case that he was already acquitted of in a state case. But yeah, the public has to ask the question, is this how we want our money and resources spent? The case of Vinnie Gorgeous Basciano. Vinnie Gorgeous Basciano was already serving life in prison. And so the government then chooses to prosecute him again while he's already serving life in prison for a death penalty case. Now, he's convicted in that case and is able to escape the death penalty. Now, how many resources in terms of tax dollars, in terms of time, in terms of the finite resources of the federal government, who could be out, prosecuting terrorists somewhere, or at least, doing something that might result in a criminal going to prison instead of keeping someone that's already going to serve life in prison there. How much in resources are they spending to keep someone in jail who's already going to die in prison? It makes no sense. And the only reason the government does it is because the people that are responsible for it get headlines. They get press, promotion, and politics. And it's not right. And it's, unfortunately, I don't know the extent to which they even have mafia trials these days because of the nature of criminal cases and the nature of the mafia these days. But unfortunately, it's not the exception, it's the norm.
And Frank, let me ask you this. During the course of covering many of these kinds of trials, have you ever developed any personal relationships with any of the defendants or their families?
Certainly. And there have been times, believe it or not, as critical as I'm being now of the government, where I've developed a relationship, a friendship with FBI agents, with prosecuting attorneys, with other reporters that cover the cases a lot differently than I do. But yes, I mean, when you see someone every day, for any length of time, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, you develop at the very least a cordial relationship with them. And when you're the only commentator in the media, giving a contrary view about a defendant's guilt or innocence, I think the family members are likely to appreciate that. So the case of the Gioeli family, I did definitely develop a friendship with them. In the case of the Gotti family, I certainly developed a relationship with them. Other people less so, but I would be friends with everybody. I like to do that. It's not going to change my view of commenting on the facts as I see them. But I would never allow or at least I would try never to allow my relationship with someone, a family member of a defendant or something like that, to alter my commentary on a specific issue.
Have you ever got any kind of heat from your colleagues in the media because you are one of the rare reporters who will be fair in kinds of cases like this? Have you ever gotten any flack from your colleagues or from people at your networks?
It's rare. Sometimes, the nature of talk radio, Matty. You've done a great talk radio show yourself for a long time. And some people that may not like you for other reasons, they throw everything in the kitchen sink at you in terms of criticizing you. So sometimes a caller may not like maybe a political view I express or the kind of topics that I cover, and they'll immediately go to, oh, you're a mafia apologist, you're this, you're that. But in terms of other reporters, I don't think so, because I think they also appreciate the fact that, one, even if I have a different take than they might have, that I'm pretty well versed on these cases, and I'll help them. I'll help them not only in terms of connecting the dots in complicated cases, knowing who's who and what this person is saying, but they'll get access to information, material, and in some cases, interviews that they wouldn't have access to unless they maintained a relationship with me. So I don't think I've ever been criticized outwardly by any reporters. Mostly the people that have been critical tend to be rats that I've been critical of. Folks like John Alight, for instance, who was one of the more dishonest witnesses that I've ever seen. He's had no problem calling me out on specific issues. But no, I don't think in terms of members of the press, I've ever heard anything negative.
Before I let you go, Frank, I would be remiss if I didn't tell my audience here that you're very responsible, along with John Tobacco, for getting me involved in radio. When I first met you and expressed an interest at that time, you were doing the Curtis Sliwa show, and you used to get me on all the time as the criminal defense expert. And Curtis was always baffled because when we talked about politics, he was kind of flabbergasted that as a criminal defense lawyer, he expected me to be a lily-livered limousine liberal, and that's what I'm not. And we had a lot of fun on the Curtis Sliwa show. You got me on as a guest for the John Rambling with Gambling show, and also Joe Piscopo. And so you've been a producer of so many shows. You've had your own radio show for a long time. You're doing the midnight shift over at 770 WABC. But now you have a new podcast. Do you have one podcast or two podcasts? I'm not sure.
So there's a podcast of the radio show. It's called The Other Side of Midnight, and people can listen to it. And I appreciate you mentioning it. And I appreciate when you've been willing to come on. You've always been a great asset. But I have also launched a podcast to speak specifically about organized crime issues. It's called The Racket Report. And it's a lot of fun. It's interesting. And we delve into a lot of different aspects of organized crime. Sometimes, usually it is related to the mafia, but not exclusively. Just recently, we did a whole episode about James Whitey Bulger and his murder, if there was something more at play there than the government would like to admit. And so we'll have on great criminal defense attorneys like you. We'll have on a lot of great journalists who've covered these issues, people like Tony DiStefano, people like Larry McShane, some great authors. Even had the curator of the Mob Museum on, some former members of organized crime themselves, as some family members of prominent organized crime members, and even prosecutors. I'm not averse to having prosecutors on as long as they're willing to answer difficult questions. Recently, I did an interview with retired federal judge John Gleason, who was the prosecutor that sent John Gotti Sr. away. I have no problem talking about these issues with anybody that wants to have a candid conversation. So it's called The Racket Report. You can access it on WABCRadio.com, or you can just search The Racket Report wherever you get your podcasts. And I appreciate you not only being willing to come on this show, but I appreciate you mentioning it here.
Okay, Frank, I know you have to go to work tonight, every night from midnight to 5 a.m. I'm usually sleeping. I'd love to be a guest on your radio show, but I'd have to be a sleepwalker to do it. I have had the privilege of being on the Rackets Report, so I hope everyone will tune into that on the internet. I guess that's YouTube, is it?
It's iTunes, it's Spotify, it's Google Podcasts, but the easiest way is just go to WABCRadio.com and you can access it there.
Okay, Frank Morano, thank you so much for being our guest. And that's it. That's a view from Mulberry Street today.